Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Peralta Online Equity Conference. We just listened to the closing keynote from Chancellor Dr. Gilkerson, and we are ready to continue with our wonderful presenters. Nicole Messier is our next presenter, and she will be talking about equitable grading strategies. Quick reminders before I pass the microphone to Nicole. Please use the chat box for your questions so that we can share them with our presenter at the end of the session. And you can always activate the Zoom captioning feature by clicking on the link below, button below. And lastly, please subscribe to our YouTube channel that I'm going to share the link in the chat so that you will have access to all videos in this year's conference and previous year's conference. So Nicole, if you're ready, the microphone is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, everybody should see my screen, right? Thumbs up. Okay, well, welcome everyone to Equitable Grading Strategies and Approaches. Today in this workshop, I'm going to give you an opportunity to reflect on your goals for assessments and grading. And then I'm going to share a lot of strategies and approaches for equitable grading, and I've organized them into three main categories. My goal is not to have everyone implement all of these strategies all at once, but kind of think of this as an a la carte menu to pick and choose and to think through what might work for you with your course, with your subject matter, with your program, with your students, and hopefully guide you through some design considerations as we work through all of these strategies and approaches today. Let me just open the chat really quick. There we go. Make sure I'm monitoring as questions come up. And then at the very end, I'm also going to give you an opportunity to reflect and hopefully maybe determine at least one of these strategies that you would like to implement in your course or courses. So here we have an image of an instructor smiling in front of a classroom, and we have a group of students, also very happy students, standing holding their course materials. And as you think about what your goals for assessment and grading are, what do you notice about the purpose of your assessments? Who is the focus of your assessments? Or who typically gains and also loses from assessments? Often as instructors, we may design assessments with ourselves in mind. We want to make sure that we're meeting our learning objectives, that we're being effective in our teaching, and that our students are indeed learning. It may be also helpful to think about designing assessments, though, with students in mind. How do we grade, give feedback, and assess students? How might we move beyond grading by empowering students to take ownership of their learning, to learn for the sake of learning, and to develop metacognitive skills, and to give them the full opportunity to show you what they have learned in your course? So I want to share these three assessment goals that can kind of help you as you reflect on your current assessment practices, kind of frame the why behind your assessments. And these are assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. A lot of assessment words here. So the first one, assessment for learning. This type of assessment happens during instruction. These are a lot of formative assessments. You might be familiar with this term here. And the data that we collect when we provide students with these formative assessments helps us to adapt our current instruction. We do a polling question and we realize that no one is getting the concept and we need to revisit this concept, right? We create videos and we ask questions throughout that video to reinforce learning. And these types of assessments allow students to practice skills. They interact with their peers, they interact with you, and they get feedback on their learning. Assessment as learning, these are evidence-based strategies that really promote student metacognitive thinking and reflection. They can be both formative and summative. Things like a 1-minute reflection, authentic assessments, and they're really about students self-regulating and owning their own learning in these types of assessment experiences. And then lastly, assessment of learning. These are our summative assessments. This is where we collect data to confirm student outcomes, whether it's for accreditation or just to know that we've done what we set out to do, right? And it allows our students to demonstrate proficiency in our course goals and learning objectives by the end of our course. These are our assessments, our exams. So I'm going to put a file, and I've made a little handout for everyone. And it also has all the strategies that I'm going to cover today. I'm going to hopefully cover all of them in the chat here for you too. And so just for about a minute, I'm going to ask you to kind of just think about, how do you currently assess students and why do you grade students? And I have some other questions for reflection as well. Let me just go back to this. There we go. So now that I've talked about these 3 whys, thinking through what types of assessments you currently have in your courses. Do you have assessment for learning, formative assessments for practice, assessments as learning, summative assessments? How many opportunities do students get to show you that they have learned in your course? In what ways do students know that they have learned? What is your purpose for grading, and how do you provide feedback to students? And I'm just going to give you about a minute just to kind of reflect before we move on to strategies. Okay, I think we're at a minute. So we will continue on. You're very welcome. So again, I organize these strategies into kind of 3 broad buckets. In the book Grading for Equity, Feldman calls them pillars. And you'll find that some of these strategies work really well together and they complement each other. Some strategies, as soon as we leave today, you can implement them. And then others are going to take more design considerations. I think it's really important to note that as you begin your journey towards equitable grading, that most instructors need to adopt a growth mindset and realize that equitable grading is a process that requires continuous quality improvements. Of all the instructors I work with, follow, and read stories about their equitable grading practices, all of them admit some failure, some hiccups along the road, and they also share lots of successes. But none of them have ever returned to traditional grading. So I think it's really important just to kind of think through each of these strategies and how it might work in your course, in your program, and in your class. So this first group is going to help you minimize bias in your assessment and grading. These strategies will also help support collaboration between peers and instructors, decrease competitiveness between peers, foster innovation and creativity, as well as reduce student stress. And I will also say reduce instructor stress, because we could all use a little less stress in our lives, right? So the first strategy that I want to share with you is reflecting on the grading of participation, and what does participation tell you about student learning? If you currently grade participation, or have a grading column that is about participation, really reflecting on what does participation mean? Does participation equal learning in your class and for your students? The grading of participation can often lead to subjective judgment of students' behaviors and has the potential for bias. It can also discourage the generation of new ideas. If a student is being graded on how they participate in a synchronous session, It can discourage them from challenging ways of thinking. It can also stifle innovation. So instead, create opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning through social annotation tools like hypothesis or perusal, asking students to identify what they still don't understand in muddiest point activities, where students are practicing metacognitive skills, as well as asking students to reflect on their learning with prompts and questions before class and after class sessions, or before an activity as well. So now let's talk about grading effort. I've seen effort used as a grading criteria, and I've also seen it as part of a description for another grading criteria. The issue with grading effort is that we can't possibly know how much effort a student put into their work. A student who performs poorly could have put in a great deal of effort, but hasn't developed the skills yet to achieve proficiency. So that student who performs poorly in an assignment receives multiple low scores, one for low quality of work or other criterion, and then another low score for effort. In a sense, being punished twice for not having developed those skills yet. Instead, really focusing on describing what quality looks like to you. What are your expectations for the assignment? By providing feedback on quality, you remove that bias of determining student effort in their work. So next, let's talk about rethinking extra credit. Awarding extra credit can reinforce extrinsic motivation, and we want students to have that intrinsic motivation, right? To learn for the sake of learning. What extra credit says is that the purpose of your course is to gain points, and it reinforces that extrinsic motivation. It can also undermine your curriculum. When you create a meaningful assessment as learning experience, and students perform poorly on that, and then you ask them to do this other activity that isn't aligned and doesn't support your course objectives. And then lastly, extra credit activities create inequities. Most extra credit activities require more time, money, resources, or even skills that we have not taught yet. And it leaves some students unable to complete it, further widening the inequities in higher education. So instead, create activities that reinforce the learning process, like asking students to reflect on how they completed their assignment. What were the challenges and what did they feel successful about? Ask students to complete reflections after receiving feedback and have them reflect on how they would improve the assignment. Also allowing for resubmissions after feedback or retakes on a test or exam. In these examples, learning is for the sake of learning and not just for those extra credit points. So now I want to talk to you about token systems, which is a way to provide flexibility and remove penalties in your courses. Token systems are utilized in specs grading, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. But what is a token system, you're probably asking? It's a set of tokens. They're imaginary tokens. They don't exist, where you're not handing out, Willy Wonka certificates or gold coins or anything like that. But each token can be redeemed for whatever activities you choose to design them for. So for example, it could be for missing a class, an assignment extension, or a retake or resubmission. It removes the stress associated with students making difficult choices. It allows students some privacy and autonomy when making choices. So for example, if I'm a student who needs to skip your class because I need to finish studying for an exam that's right after this class, and I need that extra time, or I have an opportunity to pick up another shift at work and I really need that money and I need an extension on my paper. Students don't need to divulge personal information through email begging for mercy, and instructors no longer have to manage the email requests from students. That's where the instructor less stress comes in. And students can redeem their tokens using a Google form, an ungraded quiz, or a journal entry in your learning management system with no questions asked. This type of flexibility reduces our bias in determining who is worthy of the extension or the exception. And every student receives the same opportunity to be autonomous and make choices for themselves. So the next two things that I'm going to talk about are really grading approaches. And so these are going to take a little bit more design considerations. The first one is criterion-based or standard-based grading. This is a type of grading that occurs when you implement backwards design principles, also known as understanding by design by Wiggins and McTeague. You develop course goals and outcomes, which are your big ideas. They're your umbrella for your course. And then you develop learning objectives that are measurable and attainable. These become your assessments in your course. In criterion-based grading, you design your assessments to measure the skills, knowledge, behaviors, the attitudes that you identify as course goals and learning objectives. Your grading and feedback focuses on these goals and objectives, as does your instruction. When we think about grading criteria, a lot of times we think about the concrete grading criteria, right? The declarative knowledge, the procedural knowledge, or the conditional knowledge that students need to have. But we can also build course goals and learning objectives around abstract grading criteria, things like transferable skills, critical thinking, communication, creativity. It's important that if you're grading students, that you clearly communicate to students how to demonstrate that criterion to meet your course goals and learning objectives. And so one way to do that is through a rubric. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for you right now to a rubric teaching guide. It has a lot of information as well as templates and examples. If you're not familiar with rubrics, I'm just going to talk briefly through a few different types. And the first is an analytic rubric, which analyzes your grading criteria and breaks it down into different performance levels. If you award partial points in grading or percentage of based upon performance, an analytic rubric can be used. If you have a large enrollment course and you have multiple graders, an analytic rubric can really help with the validity and the reliability of your data being collected. A holistic rubric is kind of what the name implies. It holistically assesses an entire assessment that really can't be broken down, like an essay question or a journal post or a discussion. A checklist, although it isn't a rubric, I always like to talk about these because they're used in specs grading. And you can describe your grading criteria in a checklist for students. And this clearly gives students the information of it's a yes or a no. It either meets the criterion or does not meet the criterion. And then a single point rubric, this was just designed for more dialogic reading, more personalized feedback. It only describes the grading criteria at a single point, which is the meets criterion. And then instructors give personalized feedback on the other exceeds or does not meet criterion. And then the EMRN rubric, this was designed by Robert Talbert. And I'm going to talk about this one and show you an example when we get to ungrading as well. Let me go back here. Okay, so I mentioned specs grading. If you're not familiar, specification grading, specs grading is much easier to say, is a combination of criterion-based grading, labor-based grading, and a pass-fail system. That seems very complicated, but it's actually a very simple system if you've already been using any kind of criterion-based or standard-based grading in your courses. So just like criterion-based grading, designing your course goals and learning objectives and utilizing backwards design principles is vital to the design. What specs grading does is it groups work into bundles that can vary by the amount of work or complexity. And then checklists are used to evaluate whether work meets or does not meet the criterion. Students are allowed multiple attempts to achieve the grading criterion in specs grading. So here's an example of what this can look like. And this is just an example of, say, one bundle. So here we have a bundle of work, and it's aligned to one course goal and to a set of learning objectives. And so there might be 3 quizzes, three small little assignments. They might be like an essay question or reflection question or some social annotation. And then there's one summative assessment. If this course, say, had 6 bundles, then students must complete all 6 bundles to receive an A, 5 bundles to receive a B, 4 bundles for C, and so on. In both criterion-based grading and specs grading, there is a reduction of bias as feedback and grading is based only on the criterion that are aligned to your course goals and learning objectives. And these are clearly communicated to students. And then lastly, for this group, these are a couple quick wins that you can implement in your courses. If you have an LMS system that has anonymous grading at UIC, we use Blackboard. And so you can enable anonymous grading. And if you have that available to you, test it out. Make sure to communicate to your students beforehand so that they do not put their name on any of the work that they're submitting, and see how your grading practices changed, if they did change when you don't know who completed the work. And then again, utilizing your learning management system, building in clickable rubrics. So taking that information and using the clickable rubrics that are available to you. This can help make your feedback and your scoring consistent from student to student, and semester to semester as well. Oh, are you a Canvas? I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to put links in there. But yes, we're a Blackboard. I wish we were on Canvas. So just a couple things to consider. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just give you a few seconds to reflect on all these strategies. I just would be curious in the chat if anyone is utilizing any of these strategies right now to minimize grading bias.
I use clickable rubrics.
Wonderful. How do you like them?
I love them, and in addition, you know, I just put a comment to the student about, you know, what I think was remarkable, and also what I think should be working on. And I always add, you know, if you want, you can just, you know, if you didn't have the full score in one of the criteria of the rubric, you can always go back and, you know, do a second submission on that part, giving them the chance to fix, you know, the assignment.
Wonderful. And I see lots going on in the chat here for rubrics, stopping the offering of extra credit. Wonderful. Yes. And so again, some of these strategies won't work for your course. So anonymous grading might not work because you're going to know who they are anyways, even if their name isn't on the work. Contract grading, we're going to talk about labor-based grading, which is the same thing. I love it how in education we come up with 7 different titles to say the same concept. Peer review, I'm going to talk about that as well. Wonderful. Thank you. All right, well, we're going to continue on. I do have a lot of other strategies to share with you. So the next group, we've got some takers maybe on tokens as well. Wonderful. Is about improving student motivation and learning. And so these are ideas that can help you shift from, again, that extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation for learning, that can encourage reflective practices and metacognitive thinking and encourage creativity, innovation, and risk-taking in your teaching. So the first one is really kind of simple. It's adding student choice into an assessment. And so this is an example of a summative assessment that I designed with an instructor a few years ago, where students were asked to select from a list of learning objectives, you know, which ones they wanted to reflect on. So again, not just assigning students a topic, but letting them have some choice, as well as choosing the format. This is a really easy way to kind of create an authentic assessment, a structured authentic assessment for your students, by giving them some choice. If I'm a writer, I might choose to demonstrate my learning in an essay. But if I'm a talker, I might want to create a video demonstrating my learning as well. And I'll put some information in here for a teaching guide on authentic assessments as well. But just a simple change in allowing students to select a topic or the format or product that they're producing can really help motivate students. Another way to help motivate students is to ask them their personal learning goals. This was in a capstone course where students had to identify their own personal learning goals, and they created a project based on how they would demonstrate the course goals and their personal learning goals. But you don't have to create an entire assignment to have students share their goals with you. Have a small group discussion in a breakout room synchronously. Have students post anonymously on a Padlet or another type of collaborative board that you use, or privately in a journal tool in your LMS. These activities show students that you want to know what their interests and values are in their course. Another grading system that incorporates personal learning goals is labor-based grading or contract grading, as some of you mentioned. In labor-based grading, students self-select the level of achievement they want to get. The basis of labor-based grading is that there is a direct correlation with the amount of work a student completes and the amount of learning that occurs. It does not assume that every student wants to get an A or values what you want them to get out of the course. So here's an example of what labor-based grading could look like. Students complete all of the weekly quizzes at 65% or higher. They get a D in the course. They pass the course, and that's all they're concerned about. For a C level of work, they need to complete the D level plus 4 assignments. For a B level of work, they complete the D and the C level plus 2 more assignments. And then for an A level of a work, they complete the B, C, D, and a project. Again, that correlation for the amount of work that students are doing and also the complexity. In order to receive an A, they have to design their own project. So again, really thinking through empowering students to take ownership of their learning and to increase the motivation. Another way to improve student learning is to provide multiple forms of feedback. Some of you mentioned this in the chat. And I know that providing good feedback is a challenge because it takes a lot of time. So consider adding other forms of feedback like peer review. Someone had that in the chat. Self-reflection and self-assessment. For some of your formative assignments, consider just providing feedback and not grades, which will allow you more time for personalized feedback when you aren't scoring and totaling grades and getting emails from students about how I didn't earn those points, right? If you let students know that these assignments you're just going to receive feedback on. Also consider co-constructing a rubric with your students and having students self-assess their own work before submitting it to you, or providing students with a checklist with described grading criteria and asking them to review their peers' work. All of these activities will really help improve student motivation and learning in your course. I know that I've said the process of learning quite a few times in this workshop, but really by shifting your focus from that product to the process of learning, it really helps students. They won't be focused on the fear of making mistakes. It also reduces cheating because they know that they have multiple chances to demonstrate what they know. So consider adding in more formative practice, these assessment for learning, to provide students with feedback and progress monitoring. Or design your courses to allow for multiple attempts, like in specs grading, where every student can resubmit an assignment, twice, or allow for resubmissions or retakes if a student performs poorly. If you have the ability to create question pools to draw from, this can make the retakes and resubmissions much easier. You can design assessments that are not a one and done evaluation, but also allow students either individually or as a group to reevaluate their mistakes, whether it's an exam wrapper, or I kind of call it like an assignment wrapper, where they get the feedback, you have them work collaboratively, whether that's synchronously or asynchronously, to kind of reevaluate their work and then resubmit it. Or consider a full redesign of your summative assessments to allow students to demonstrate their proficiency by the end of your course. And I do have an example of what this looks like. And this would be a very simplified course, but it fits on the screen really well and on my slides. So imagine if this was my course and I only had 3 course goals and a certain amount of learning objectives supporting each course goal. And as well as having authentic assessments and other formative assessments, I have 3 unit tests in my course. And so as a student, I'm only being assessed on a certain course goal at a time. Typically, when we do assessments, we tend to arrange them in by type, right? We have a group of multiple choice, we have a group of fill in the blank, short answer, essay. And this sort of redesign your scaffolding, your assessments, so that it's not a one and done experience for your students. So if the students take the unit 1, the course goal 1 test, and you set a certain threshold of questions that they should answer, right? And they don't demonstrate that. Then in the unit 2, you can utilize adaptive release in your LMS. And students have that second opportunity to get reassessed in course goal 1. For students that showed that proficiency in that first test, they receive a different test that only has course goal 2. If I'm a student who still has not met that threshold of proficiency after my unit 2 test, in my unit 3 test, I have the opportunity again to demonstrate my course goal 1, course goal 2, and course goal 3. So learning is not a one and done, but really students can take until the very end of the course to demonstrate their proficiency in my learning objectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about ungrading now. When we think about the process of learning, this is really what ungrading is focused on, is by providing feedback. And feedback can be, again, through self, peer, and instructors. There is actually research that shows when students receive feedback with grades, they are more successful in implementing feedback and growing and learning from feedback when there are no grades attached to that feedback. And there's some form of self-evaluation and reflection that is always built into the design of ungrading. And I mentioned the EMRN rubric. This was designed by Robert Talbert from Grading for Growth. It's a wonderful blog, and I'm going to put a link in the chat for you here as well, so that you have it. There we go. And so this kind of acts like a checklist that's expanded. And so the main questions that students get feedback on: does the work demonstrate thorough understanding of the concepts? Does the work meet the expectations? So it's a yes or no, right? Very easy to give students feedback that way. And then it's broken down further, where if it's a yes, then students get feedback if it just met the expectations, or if it really exceeded it, if it's excellent, exemplary. And then for the students that receive that no, again, it's broken down into 2 different levels. And so the students will know whether it simply needs a little bit of revision, or it really needs to be worked on extensively because it's not accessible at this time. Oh, I got a yay on grading, yes. So here's an example of ungrading in a project-based course. And so this has multiple levels of feedback that are given to students, but there are no grades. There are due dates and there are assignments. It is a very student-centered authentic assessment where students submit a proposal in week 3. They do a literature review in week 5. There's a peer review that happens in week 6 with feedback. There's a draft of the project in week 8. Again, there's peer review built in. There's a self-assessment, reflection, and final deliverables are due. And then there's a meeting with the instructor and the student to discuss their progress and their grade. even if you aren't ready to completely remove grades, consider just providing feedback on an assignment without grading it and see what the responses are from your students. How do students improve their work when they're not given a grade? And so I'm going to give you, let's see, we've got time, a minute. If any of you would like to share and just reflect on these strategies to improve student motivation and learning. Any comments or questions? I know there's been a lot of things in the chat. Let's see. Any questions so far? I love that you rebelled against grading effort. Thank you. That's wonderful. You allow students to retake exams and redo assignments after receiving feedback. Do you give them a grade? I'm curious, Shirley.
I don't give them a grade when I give them the actual feedback. I allow them, if they want to make the revision, to do it, and I let them know it's absolutely optional if they want to or not. They can choose.
That's wonderful. All right, so Shirley's a good resource if you're looking to pull back on sharing grades with students and really focusing on feedback and growing students.
Can I simply unmute to ask my question?
Oh, yes, feel free.
Okay, so I pasted the question in. I'm sure a lot of us face this. Students have been trained, most of them, to work to a grade. That's just part of the system that we have, and we don't control what they come in with. And a lot of them have a lot less time on their hands than they really have the ability to be full-time students and to really fully invest in learning.
Mm-hmm.
So when you remove the grade, which I've done, I've oftentimes seen the level of effort and the quality of the work just collapse as they make a rational assessment. I'm not being graded here, or the grade's easy here, and there's a consequence, but I am being graded in this other class, and so I'm going to put in more effort over there and less here. Do you have thoughts about this?
I do. And I've actually, I mean, I've read and I've worked with instructors that have kind of done the extreme and like pulled everything away and then kind of put some parameters back. And I think that's where setting up expectations for assignments and letting students know clearly, like, these are the things that I'm looking for. These are the expectations in your assignment. Having criterion. You don't have to say grading, but you can. And it can just be about giving feedback. But I think establishing for students, like, these are the expectations. This is what I want you to get out of this assignment. This is the why. You know, a lot of times the struggle is, well, what am I really getting out of doing this work? Is it just work for the sake of work because you need to give me a grade? But these are the skills that I really want you to come away with. And then I want to be able to help you grow and be successful in your career. And so I think there's a balance there of providing structured feedback to students and holding back that grade, and still letting students know. And I'm going to talk about some grading scales as well that might help with this too, where you can still give students some feedback on whether they've met a standard or not met a standard, so that they kind of know where they're at in the course. And there's ways to communicate that as well. But thank you.
What I hear you saying is we tap into their intrinsic desire to learn, which of course we're trying to do, but there's this very specific kind of incentive structure that that we have all been trained into and that they are living with right now. And that is the incentive of the grade. So I hear what you're saying. I think those all make really good sense. And I think we still have this problem where students are so focused on have that as the incentive.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, thanks.
I mean, and that's the culture. I mean, from kindergarten on, we have drilled this letter that's so important to students, that we've lost the joy of learning, and the focus on what the process is, for learning. I do want to
Yeah.
get to the last set of strategies, which I really think you're going to like, which is all about grading accuracy. And when I say accuracy, I'm not talking about mathematical accuracy. What I'm talking about is, what does a number, percentage, or letter grade actually tell us about students' performance and learning in your course? And so I want to share just a few grading scales and practices to consider to increase your grading accuracy. So I think we're all familiar with this one here, which is the traditional point scale, right? It's 0 to 100. We have 60 points for failing. And my question to you all is, why do we need such a range to describe failure? How did we ever decide that this was the best practice to use? Whereas a minimum point grading scale assigns a value to failure that is more mathematically accurate and reasonable than a 100-point scale. Failing grades are within a 10-point range, just as A's are. So a student with a failing grade doesn't have to work any harder to raise their grade from a F to a C than a student who needs to raise their grade from a C to an A. One reason students fail is early catastrophic failure, when students get off to a poor start and then they never recover from that failure. A minimum grading was designed primarily to address this one reason. In a research study, they found that minimum grading works to mediate the inherent inequities of traditional grading. And it does so only on a limited scale for a relatively small subset of students in a way that does not induce grade inflation or social promotion. So what does this look like? Using the minimum point scale, a student has the following grades. You know, they enrolled late, they didn't read the syllabus, they didn't realize there was going to be an assignment right away, and they missed the first assignment, or they missed the first exam. In a traditional scale, if we were to average their grades, the student gets a 63.4. If this is the requirement for their degree, they're going to have to retake this course, right? Using a minimum point scale, the lowest percentage that a student can get is the 50. And so what this does is it allows a student who starts off poorly to be able to recover their grade. Another way to improve the accuracy of your grading is to avoid giving zeros. And this can be accomplished in a few ways. First, by allowing students to submit late work without penalty. We design our assessments as opportunities to learn and practice. And by awarding a 0 to students, we send the message that deadlines in grading is more important than learning. So a more equitable approach is to allow students to submit late work without penalty. If you have a small enrollment course, you could allow for work to be accepted until the midterm for the first half of the course and until the final for the second half of the course. In a research study by Rouge with a large enrollment course, they 347 students, whew, can you imagine? They had a preferred deadline, and then they had a staggered approach for extension deadlines. And what they found was that 41% of the students used the extension deadline once, 37% used it more than once, and then 22% of the students never used the extension deadline. The other approach is to utilize a minimum point scale so that students who miss an assessment are able to recover. Again, thinking through the student at midterm who's failing the class versus the student at midterm with a minimum point scale that has a C in the class. And although I've just shared several examples of averaging grades, my question to you all is, what does the averaging of grades really tell us about our students' learning? So let's look at these two students here. I know that I'm at time. If you all can hang tight, I've just got a couple more slides to go. Is that okay? Yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thinking through this first student here, they have performed almost consistently at an A average, but they have one really poor score. If we average their grade, it's an 82. If we drop their lowest score, which a lot of instructors do, it's a 92.7. What does the average really tell us? If we were to go with the 82 versus the 92? Or what if I told you that the 40 was actually the first grade that the student received? And then after that first assessment, they understood the expectations in the course and then performed at a 90% or higher. What should the grade be in that course? Should it be an average of those grades, or should it just be the final grade of 94? For the second student here, they had a 62, a 72, and a 93. If we average the grades, it's 75. If we drop the lowest score, it's an 82. But what if this was a project? And so the students resubmitted the work 2 times and received feedback and improved it, and their final performance was a 93. Should their grade be the average, the 75? Should it be the 82? Or should it be the 93? So just some considerations to think at, what does averaging accurately reflect the student's final learning in your courses? The last couple of grading scales I want to share is a straight point scale. And so this is where assessments are weighted by assigned points. There are no categories or averaging of grades. And students can easily total their points and know where they are in your course. There is no mathematical wizardry that needs to occur for students to know what their grade is. They can simply add up their points and see where they're at. So if I'm a student who's reached, say, 170, then I can make a choice not to complete the last assignment in this course because I already have a B, and I can focus my efforts on a course where I may not be performing as well. And so what this looks like is a straight point scale. You total your points, and you know exactly where your grade is. There's no stress when it comes to students understanding their grade. And then the last 2 grading scales, Nikki, this one is for you, is standard-based scale and a 4-point scale. And so what these scales do is they replace points, although it's misleading because it does say 4-point scale. But the students are provided with a description of what the scale means. So you're providing them with a feedback that they met the standard, whether you're giving them a letter grade or you're giving them a number. But these numbers are just representation. They're not added or averaged to determine a grade. They're just a guide to students to provide them with some feedback and direction. So if you're looking to pull back on grades, utilizing something like a 4-point scale, where you're still giving students feedback on where they're at in the course without having to deal with points and averaging, can be really meaningful. So again, students receive, there's 5 summative assessments in this course. They get a B or a 3. They have 1 assignment where they perform at a C or a 2 level. You have a conversation with them at the end of the course, and you decide that their final grade is a B. So it still provides them with some scaffolding. It reduces that anxiety when they're used to receiving a grade as well. And so lastly, just thinking through all of these strategies to increasing your grading accuracy, and really thinking through what do grades tell you about a student's learning in your course. And then in the handout at the very bottom, you're also going to see some questions for reflection. So, what strategies do you use right now that really support student learning? I mean, how are you sharing those with your colleagues? We are, I know Shirley, and it sounds like Nick as well. You're exploring alternative grading. I'm seeing lots of things happening in the chat as well. So how are you sharing those best practices with your colleagues? And then what strategies or approaches are you most open to considering today? And what are you going to try first? I'm really thinking through that. I'm going to also put a link, or not a link. Here are my slides as well. I didn't get to share all of the links that are embedded in here. There are resources as well as the research that I've done on equitable grading. This came out of a teaching guide that I wrote, I think it was 2 years ago. It's listed right here. And just kind of my desire to give back to your organization because I love your equity rubric. So thank you for having me today, and I'll hang out if anyone has questions or comments as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate this presentation. And this is such a hot topic. This topic makes people so curious. And looking at the number of people in the room, we understand that people are really interested in learning more about equitable grading. So it is challenging because, as you said, when we give feedback, we have to make sure the quality is there, equity is there, and it takes time, as you acknowledge that too. And as Nikki mentioned during the presentation, it's also challenging. Like, what about the other students who care so much about grading? How are we going to make sure they're focusing on, they're still on track, etc.? So these are wonderful things to discuss. I'm just like, we have 9 minutes for the other session to start, but just looking at the chat quickly to see. Yes, can you please share the slides? Would it be possible to share the slides?
So I did put them in the chat as well.
Yeah,
Did
I see.
get that? Okay.
Okay, wonderful. And wonderful comments. Please take a look at the chat, Nicole.
Yes, thank you everyone for participating. I know it's a really short amount of time. I normally do this workshop in like 90 minutes or 2 hours. So I had to actually cut a lot of strategies. The handout at the very bottom has the Grading for Growth website. If you're not familiar with that blog, it's 20 small practices so again, I cut a lot, but there's even more. So yeah, feel free to reach out. My email address is also on the opening slide.
And Nicole, just quickly, I would like to also acknowledge one of the questions in the chat that I missed before. Pamela is asking if you answer in 1 or 2 minutes, that would be wonderful. Pamela is asking, what do you do about students who are not coming to class very often, as well as not participating in class discussions? What is your strategy for them?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things happening here. And so we have to think about how do we engage all of our learners. When we ask questions in class and we have conversations, there are a lot of students who come to college. I was one of them that didn't have the self-efficacy. They didn't believe they belonged, that they could add value to the discussion. And so they're scared to be wrong. And they're scared, there's kind of that, we're an urban college as well, and we serve a lot of first generation college students. And so really building that sense of belonging and community and that everyone brings value is really important. And then also utilizing both asynchronous discussion, so things like social annotation tools or a Padlet board or something that is not as scary to students, to get them talking asynchronously first and then having them go into a discussion where they can see that, their idea got a vote or got a heart, or you responded to their asynchronous sharing. That can go a long way to boost a student's self-efficacy and their belief that they can contribute, to their learning community as well.
Can I jump in here? That question was in regards to giving students sort of this passing grade at the beginning that you were talking about, just that they start kind of at, a C level almost. But if they aren't coming to class and they're not participating, I mean, at what point do you go, okay, I'm going to have to give you a D or an F?
So is this in reference to the minimum point scale? Is that what
Yes.
you're? Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't put that in the.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to get reference.
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 things that you're talking about then. You're talking about participation. And I think it's important to recognize that our value in our course is not the same value as our students. They have competing priorities. Again, at UIC, most of our students are working. The idea of traditional students is no longer a thing. That is not the norm anymore. And so really recognizing, why am I placing value on this thing that maybe not every student can be a part of? If they're able to demonstrate learning in your assessments, is that enough? If you know, if there are certain components that you need to have required in order to be able to assess students and know that they've learned the information, then making sure that that's clearly communicated to students. Like, you know, these sessions are really important for this reason. And I need you to be engaged in this for these specific reasons, because they meet my course goals or learning objectives.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, everyone. We only have 4 minutes before we start the upcoming session, so it's gonna be a very short break for everyone. But don't go anywhere, because the following presenter will be also talking about. We're kind of like switching a little bit from grading to homework and assessment platforms, so which are directly related. So don't go anywhere. We're gonna start in 4 minutes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great session.
Thank you. Thank you for joining, everyone.
And I see Delmar is here. And we can get him set up as we get the next moderator set up as well.
Yep. Kevin, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Excellent, Dave. I'm the next moderator. So if you want to switch over the host